Hey guys, I'm Dave and welcome to the Trull Gallery. Today, we're going to try to make a pair of French doors fit their opening. A client reached out to me recently because they have these French doors that don't quite fit. Apparently, when they bought the house, there were no doors here, and they lived with it for a while, but eventually decided to upgrade. They measured their opening and went to the big box store to buy doors that should fit. They don't. But not knowing where to go from there, they just kind of lived with this space. I took a look at it. I figured with a little bit of work, we could make these doors look like they were designed for this opening, which clearly they were not. Let's see if we can pull this one off. The first thing to do is determine the size of the existing gap, or more importantly, how much stock I'll have to add to these doors so they'll meet without binding. The gap was a snug 3/4 of an inch. I taped together some handy shims to make a bundle that was 5/8 of an inch thick. With that in place, I could still open the doors without any rubbing. That's my starting point. This will get messy, so I'm going to pull the doors and take them to the shop. Before I do that, I want to mark the height of the doorknobs. I put a painter's tape on both doors, and I marked the first one at 36 inches from the floor. I used my torpedo level to make a line across both doors, and I'll use that later. I also marked where the fixed door touches the door stop on the top. I'll be adding some trim to the front, and I don't want them to touch. I pulled the hinges so I could take the doors back to the shop. I prefer to take out the 2 outer screws from each hinge, and then take the center screw from the bottom and top, leaving the center middle screw for last. Just make sure to support the door before removing these last few screws. Back at the shop, I started by ripping down some clear pine to just over 1 3/8, the thickness of these doors. I knew I didn't have a lot of room to play with here, so before resawing the board in half, I changed to my thin kerf 7 1/4 inch blade. The kerf on this is almost half a standard blade and will leave me with just the right amount of stock. 2 passes on the table saw, keeping the same face against the fence, and I've got 2 pieces just over 5/16 of an inch thick. A couple of light passes through my planer not only cleans up the saw marks, but reduces the stock to their final width. To make sure I've got them small enough, I checked the thickness of my test pack and it came in at 0.64 inches. When I put the calipers on my strips, they came in at 0.62 inches. With any luck, that'll give me enough clearance once everything is back in place. My strips are longer than necessary, so I used the door to mark their length. I took both strips to the miter saw and cut them at the same time. I made a point to mark the strips about 1/4 of an inch long, and I'll trim them to size later once they're installed. The trim molding for the fixed door came next. I set it flush to the bottom of the door and marked its length from the pencil line I had placed on the door before taking off the hinges. I set my mark about 1/8 of an inch below the line so the trim wouldn't interfere with the door closing. Then that went over to the miter saw and was cut to size. These doors still have the factory primer, but no paint. Since glue bonds better to raw wood, I took a few minutes to sand off the primer on the edge of both doors. Now I can lay a bead of glue on the door edge and spread it out for a good bond. I set the filler strip in place and tacked it to the door with a few 18-gauge brads. The brads are there to stop the strip from sliding around until I get them in the clamps. I made sure not to set any brads anywhere that I'll be drilling or routing later. With both strips tacked in place, the 2 doors were set on clamps. The doors act as cauls, providing equal pressure along the entire joint. Once I got it clamped up, I let the glue dry for an hour or so. While the glue was setting, I moved on to building a jig to route the grooves for the door bolts. It's made from some 1/2 inch birch ply, and the key component is that middle strip. It's just a hair wider than the bolts. It's snug, but not too tight. The cross piece you see is the stop for the edge of the door, so I don't route any farther than I need to. I found the center line, and then marked for the first of the 2 jig side stops. I offset from that line 3/8 of an inch and drilled a few holes for mounting screws. Then I flipped the jig around and countersunk those holes so the screw heads will not interfere with the router. Then I clamped the first stop in place and screwed it to the jig. Before adding the second side stop, I put a piece of blue tape on the first so the jig wouldn't be too tight in use. Then I could set the jig in place on the door, hold the second stop in place, and draw a line representing the outside of the stop. I drew a line 3/8 of an inch inside the line I just drew, and used that to pre-drill some mounting holes like before. I took the jig back to the door, held the pieces snugly in place, and then added my 3 fasteners. My jig is now ready to use, so let's clean up those doors. I stood the first door upright using a hand screw to help hold it steady. Then I used my 1/4 inch downcut flush trim spiral bit with the Bits and Bits asphalt coating to clean up the overhang. I started at the end grain, went up one side and then down the other. While the door was in place, I filled the brad holes with some DAP spackle. It dries quickly and sands easily. I also made a point to fill any gap between the door and the filler strip I added. I wanted this to be as seamless as possible once it was painted. This door was set aside to dry, and I repeated the process on the second door. Once the spackle was dry, I sanded off all the excess with 150 grit disc on my random orbit sander. I also took the time to remove any machining marks on the edge before cleaning up the faces of the doors. I eased the edges first with the sander, and then followed that up with some hand sanding. I don't want them round, I just want to get rid of any sharp edges that the kids could get caught on. To cut the door bolt slot in the fixed door, I started by setting my jig in place and securing it with 1 screw. I swapped over to a template bit in my palm router and set my depth for the first pass. I went up one side and down the other. This 1/2 inch bit cleaned out the slot in those 2 passes. I reset my bit height for second pass and repeated the process. Today's safety tip: if your shop fans are blowing right at you while you're routing, you may want to switch them off. While the jig was in place, I used a sharp chisel to square the corners on my slot. The jig keeps the chisel in line, making sure that the edges of the door stays clean looking. I repeated this for the other end of the door before resetting my bit height for the final cut. The bit is just a hair deeper than the bolt, so it'll sit just below the edge of the door. The bearing now rides against the previous passes. One more cleanup of the corners, and if all goes well, the bolt will fit snugly in place. The bolts were secured with 2 screws each, although I did remove them prior to priming the door. And while I'm here, let's fill that screw hole. Both doors need knobs, although the fixed door will not have any working parts, just the knobs themselves. I had the height line that I had set before removing the doors and transferred that line to the edge. To locate the knob hole, you can use a pattern that comes with the kit or just measure like I did, although I did double check with the pattern. This step may not be necessary, but I usually use it when attempting to drill clean holes with a hole saw. I'll start with a 1/4 inch pilot hole that goes through the door. Any blowout from this will be removed shortly. With my pilot hole set, I switch over to the proper size hole saw, or 2 1/8 inches in this case. I drill about halfway through, flip my door over, and complete the cut from the other side. This gives me a clean hole with no blowouts on either face. It also makes it easy to remove the plug from the hole saw. Once both knob holes were drilled, I set the swing door back in my hand screw so I could drill the latch hole comfortably. I put a 1-inch Forstner bit in my drill guide to help me keep this hole square to the door's edge. Then I bore through the door until my bit clears the larger knob hole on the face. The fixed door got a similar hole in the same location, but that one was only about an inch deep, and this will be for the strike plate once the doors are installed. I installed the latch and knob in the door and used a box cutter to trace the outline of the latch face on its edge. The hardware was removed and I set my router depth to the thickness of the latch face. Once I was happy with the depth, I cleaned out most of the material, staying just inside my lines. A little cleanup with the chisel, and the latch set just below the surface of the door. It was time to add the filler strip to the fixed door. This strip is 1.5 inches wide, so I used my square to mark a layout line 3/4 in from the edge. And rather than sand the door face, I used some CA glue to secure the trim. I set it in place along the line I had just drawn, and just shy of the top line I made while the doors were installed. Then I secured the trim in place with some narrow crown staples. The crown of the staple is more secure than the head of a brad, and they're still small enough to be hidden easily. Once the trim was fully secured, I came back with more spackle and filled those staple holes. It was set aside to dry and sanded smooth later. Since I was set on this being a one-day project, I grabbed my shellac-based primer and gave the raw edge one coat. In the Florida heat, this stuff dries in minutes, although the can says 45. I was driving the doors back across town well before that. After wrestling the doors back in position and reconnecting the hinges, it was time to see if they fit. Let's just say that no one was more surprised than I was. The fit was nearly perfect. I started adding hardware with the doorknob assembly on the swing door. Since everything was pre-fit in the shop, this went fairly easily. Once that was set, I added the knob on the fixed door. Next up were the door bolts. These also went in easily since I did all the fussy work in the shop. The top bolt went in just like the bottom. Just make sure the locking mechanism moves out of the door so they'll catch once their holes are drilled, which I apparently forgot to record. One hole was drilled in the floor, and another was drilled into the upper door frame. The fixed door can now be locked in the closed position. To install the strike plate, I drew a center line on the door edge, set the strike in place, and marked a location along that line for the 2 mounting screws. I used my spring-loaded center punch to mark the hole, and then screwed the strike in place. Again, I used my box cutter to outline the location, and then used a chisel to remove the waste. You don't need to go too deep here, so take light passes and test your depth often. I kept adjusting my mortise until the strike sat evenly and just below the edge of the door. If all goes to plan, the latch will make a solid connection with the strike and hold the doors closed. With everything in place, these doors look the way they should, and the kids can now play video games in there without disturbing the rest of the family. Not all of my projects are what you might call normal, and this unusual repair was one of them. Hardware and materials for this ran about $75, and it took me about 6 hours to complete. My clients wanted to paint the doors themselves, and I think they did a nice job. More importantly, being able to close and latch these doors now gives them the extra privacy they wanted from the beginning. Love to hear your thoughts on this video. Is there something I could have done different, easier, smarter? Drop in the comments below. As usual, I've listed some of the tools and materials I used in this repair. And I've also have my Amazon affiliate link below that shows a lot of the tools I use on a day-to-day basis. And should you need one of those tools and buy it through those links, it does help keep this channel going. If you enjoyed this video, maybe give us a thumbs up and share it with friends. If you haven't already, maybe it's time to hit that subscribe button and little bell so you get notified each time I put out a new video. As usual, don't have a clue what's coming up next because I got a new challenge coming up next week, but more on that later. So until then, have a great day, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.